Thank you all for coming this evening. My name is Ross Faith. I'm the Executive Director of the Tulsa Debate League. We are an urban debate league in Tulsa. Our mission is to provide students in Title I schools with the opportunity to participate in debate education programs that build critical thinking and communication skills that help them succeed in college and career. The goal of our public debate tonight over educational equity is really twofold. One is to showcase the power of debate education to teach critical thinking skills. You're going to get to see two of our awesome debaters showcasing how to do argument the right way. In the age of social media and in TV sound bites, debate has been reduced frequently to name-calling and unsubstantiated argumentation. What you'll see tonight is a style of debate where evidence and reasoning are privileged over name-calling. We also hope that this debate will provide a model of civil dialogue. So unfortunately, our 2016 presidential campaign was not a model of civil dialogue. These two young men have exceeded in maturity many candidates for presidential office in this country, and they will be demonstrating that. Unfortunately, also, Facebook and social media, in a lot of cases in our society, have degenerated into uncivil dialogue. And what we hope is to show you how students can model what it means to disagree with somebody and still be able to be colleagues afterwards. You're also going to get to see, so the format of the evening is, there's two parts, really. There's a debate, followed by a panel discussion afterwards with an illustrious group of community leaders from our city. And I'm going to have the moderator introduce those folks. The two debaters are in your program. On the affirmative tonight is Joshua Taha. Josh, if you'd raise your hand. Josh is from Will Rogers High School. He's a junior. He has been in the finals of our city championship tournament 2 years in a row. And he's a fantastic debater. He was in the quarterfinals of the state tournament this year. And then on the right is CJ Padillo from Langston Hughes Academy. He will be debating on the negative this evening. And so we'll talk in a minute about the topic. Hannibal's going to go over what the topic will be. Essentially, you're going to see each debater give 3 speeches: an opening speech, a rebuttal speech, and then finally a closing. There'll be a brief period where they're going to ask each other questions in the middle. So the debate in total will last about 20 minutes. The panelists will be discussing the debate itself and the issues that have arisen during the debate. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsors for this evening. The Oklahoma Humanities Council made this possible through a generous grant to help this night be possible. The University of Tulsa and the University of Tulsa College of Law as well for allowing us to use this beautiful facility. Crow and Dunlevy, as well as Consumer Affairs, the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Foundation, and the George Kaiser Family Foundation. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Hannibal Johnson. Hannibal is a Harvard Law School graduate, an author, attorney, and consultant specializing in diversity and inclusion issues, human relations, leadership, and nonprofit leadership and management. He has taught at the University of Tulsa College of Law, Oklahoma State University, and the University of Oklahoma. His books, including Black Wall Street, Up from the Ashes, Acres of Inspiration, Apartheid in Indian Country, and his most recent book, The Sonars of Chandler, chronicle the African-American experience in Oklahoma and its indelible impact on American history. Johnson's play, Big Mama Speaks, a Tulsa Race Riot survivor story, was selected for the 2011 National Black Theater Festival and has been staged in Caux, Switzerland. He's received numerous honors and awards for his work and community service. So if you'd join me in welcoming Hannibal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Tulsa Debate League, welcome to Debating Educational Equity, a public debate focused on the legacy of the unanimous landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision handed down by the United States Supreme Court on May 17, 1954. Brown heralded the end of legal or de jure segregation in American public schools. Let's begin by honoring the civil rights activist who, as a Kansas schoolgirl, was at the heart of that fateful decision. This phenomenal woman, Linda Brown, died at age 75 on March 25th, 2018, in her hometown of Topeka, Kansas. Please join me in a moment of silence in memory of Linda Brown. Thank you. Now, critics pounced on the Brown decision. They blasted the Supreme Court for its failure to prescribe a time frame and concrete guidelines within which to effect school desegregation. The court forged a compromise, issuing an order for federal courts to oversee the creation of racially non-discriminatory school districts with all deliberate speed. That language, while seeming to indicate an expectation of diligent haste, left the time frame vague, open to interpretation, and difficult to enforce. Still, Brown marked the beginning of the slow and painful end of legal segregation in public education in the United States. While most of us celebrate this important milestone, de facto segregation persists. White flight, neighborhood housing patterns, poverty, racial steering, and other factors make public school segregation a lived reality, despite the tantalizing legal abstraction forged by Brown. Our work is incomplete for yet another reason: the achievement gap. This evening, we also highlight the unfinished post-Brown work that focuses less on access and more on equity. What did Brown get right? What did it miss? What remains to be done? We cannot address those questions without some notice of race. Race, that centuries-old social construct that still defines, defiles, and delimits, seems an inescapable reality, even in 2018. Race underlies empirically real distinctions and disparities, including those in the realm of public education. Harvard-educated sociologist, historian, civil rights activist, and author, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois famously and rightly noted in his 1903 masterpiece, The Souls of Black Folk, that the problem of the 20th century was that of the color line. That problem still poses a clear and present danger, now in the 21st century, more than 100 years removed. Why is that? The answer to the why necessarily involves an examination of our history of subjugation, oppression, and levels of constructive engagement. That legacy has profoundly shaped what was, what is, and what will be. In 1896, the highest court in the land embraced racial segregation. Plessy versus Ferguson gave legal sanction to what had theretofore been a mere custom and practice. Supreme Court endorsement helped establish a deep and inequitable social hierarchy that, though largely legally eradicated with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, persists as a practical matter. While de jure segregation in public schooling is largely a thing of the past, de facto segregation remains a too often unquestioned, unchallenged reality for many. In 2016, the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, made findings that echoed what advocates for low-income and minority students have said for years. America's public schools, 64 years after Brown, are increasingly segregated by race and by class. GAO investigators noted that between 2000 and 2014, both the percentage of K-12 public schools in high poverty and the percentage of such public schools made up mostly of African American or Hispanic students more than doubled. The percentage of all schools with so-called racial or socioeconomic isolation grew from 9% to 16%. Researchers define isolated schools as those in which 75% or more of the students are of the same race or same class. These schools offer disproportionately fewer math, science, and college prep courses and had higher rates of students who were held back in the 9th grade, suspended, or expelled. What's more, GAO investigators found public charter schools A key strategy in improving education for such students may take minority and poor students from larger, more diverse public schools and enroll them into less diverse schools. As we move through the evening, let's reflect on a few key questions. To what extent have we fulfilled the promise of Brown versus Board of Education? Does the removal of racial barriers and even the mixing of races and ethnicities lead, without purposeful facilitation, to true integration? Left to our own devices, will the inclination to segregate diminish, or must there be intentional interventions? To what extent is persistent segregation a continuing threat? If the target is equity in education, is desegregation the best arrow in our quiver? To what extent are charter schools and voucher programs enhancing or eroding any gains attributable to Brown? And to what extent are efforts around charter schools and vouchers racialized? Our debate proposition for the evening is as follows. Resolved, that the United States should withhold federal funds from public school districts that fail to adopt a plan and a reasonable timetable for the integration of public schools within their respective jurisdictions. It's my pleasure to reintroduce Ross Faith to lead the student debate portion of our program.
Thank you, Hannibal. And in my haste to get this debate started, I didn't really introduce CJ properly. CJ was one of two teams that made it to the national tournament this year, the Urban Debate National Championship this year in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University. He was also a semifinalist at the state tournament. And these two have gone round and round throughout the year, competing to be two of our best debaters. So we will get started. The debate will proceed this way. I'm going to be timing. There will be a 3-minute opening statement given by each team, a 2-minute rebuttal given by each team, followed by a 3-minute cross-examination where they'll be asking each other questions, followed by a 1.5 minute closing. So without further ado, I'll let Josh Taha take the stage. Thanks, Josh.
In the year 1950, Oliver Brown attempted to enroll his daughter Linda at Sumner Elementary. Linda Brown was in 3rd grade at the time, and she was denied enrollment. The Brown family was not alone, however. 12 other brave families were also denied enrollment, and they spurred a movement. Brown versus Board was now a Supreme Court case. And then, let's fast forward to May 17, 1954. The court has just reached a unanimous decision. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. People across America, and by extension the world, wondered if this was the start of a brighter, more equitable future for education in America. However, the Brown 2 decision led to desegregation being carried out with all deliberate speed, a sentiment that is entirely too vague for a court hearing. And it was overturned in Griffin versus County School Board of Prince Edward County. And then almost 64 years after the original decision, schools are now resegregating today. After debating for in-school integration throughout this entire school year, I can state that we need integration with utter urgency. Which brings me on to my next point. Students at segregated schools have worse educational outcomes than students at integrated schools. Segregated schools fail to offer diverse courses, have high teacher turnover rates, and low graduation rates. To quote Derek Black, a professor of law at the University of South Carolina School of Law, the only tried, tested, and cost-effective solution to unequal and inadequate education is integration. Next, integration helps eliminate racism and prepare students for a diverse world. Amy Wells, a PhD candidate in sociology and education policy at Columbia University, states that while racial segregation can perpetuate racial fear, intergroup contact and critical cross-racial dialogue can help to ameliorate these issues. Whether we like to admit it or not, we are more in control of our future than we think. The choice is ours. We can either stand there and do nothing while youth all across America are denied access to an equitable education, or we can take a stand. Linda Brown passed away on March 25th of this year, and she died before she was able to truly witness an equal education system. Education is such a huge part of society, and withholding funds from school districts that don't integrate is a perfect way to eliminate the inequality in the education sector. Integration improves the quality of education for all, and it helps break down racism. To quote Sonia Sotomayor, the first Hispanic Supreme Court justice, "Until we get equality in education, we won't have an equal society." Which brings me back to the resolution. Resolved, the United States should withhold federal funds from public school districts that fail to adopt a plan and a reasonable timetable for the integration of public schools within their respective jurisdiction. Thank you.
Okay. A few months ago, I was having a conversation with my role model and history teacher, Mr. Knowles. He gave me a piece of wisdom. He told me to be careful of jumping into things too quickly, to weigh all my options first, then to choose what's best. So with this principle, I stand in firm opposition to the affirmative. We must not jump onto the affirmative without weighing all possible solutions. These are the 3 reasons of the negative. 1, Brown versus Board of Education decreased role models in schools. 2, teacher pay is extremely low and they need a raise. And 3, funding is the best way to solve inequality. On the role models. Mandatory integration is bad. Brown versus Board of Education took role models out of school. At Langston Hughes Academy, I see many successful African Americans. They are my role models and the affirmative plan would take this away. Brown versus Board of Education saw a huge decrease in the amount of African American teachers, principals, and staff in general. Michael Folks, a professor of educational policy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, stated, after Brown versus Board of Education, 38,000 black teachers and administrators lost their job. That would happen again if we went through with the affirmative plan. Next, teacher pay is extremely low and is causing high stress and an influx of teachers searching for second and even third jobs. This hurts education and the affirmative doesn't solve this. Mr. Daniels is my debate coach at Langston Hughes Academy. He came to Langston Hughes to be a drama teacher, but he's the bus driver and a history teacher as well. Teachers are paid so low that they must work a second job. Nevertheless, this affects your children's education because every second our teachers are pushed away from our classrooms. That's less time for them to plan, that's less time for them to grade papers, less time for them to pick grades in. This puts stress on teachers, and it makes it so that they have less sleep, less time off, and more to worry about. Mr. Daniels is only one teacher that has to deal with this reality. Now, next. Lack of resources. The affirmative can't solve inequality in schools because low-income minority schools are unequal because of a lack of funding and resources. See, low-income and mostly minority school districts don't have enough funding to compete with these higher-income schools. Usually the higher amount of funds the school has, the higher percentage white students, which is where the affirmative gets their correlation and causation wrong. They think that because there's more whites and because there's less of diversity in the school, that thereby means that they will have less educational attainment, which isn't true. You see, equitable funding is the best way to solve the inequalities in education today. There's no other solutions. So, in conclusion, Mr. Knowles is a wise man. His lesson I shared with you in the beginning is something that's important not only to this debate, but life in general. The affirmative has a great goal, but there's a better way to solve educational inequity without the consequences of the affirmative. Members of the audience, I urge you to side with the negative because of my 3 arguments. 1, Brown versus Board of Education decreased role models. 2, teacher pay is extremely low and they need a raise. And 3, funding is the best way to solve inequity in education. Thank you.
Mandatory integration might not have been handled well in the past, but society has advanced. We are much better about things now, and these students need their role models. I agree with that, and we can keep those role models employed and we can integrate schools as well. Let's refer back to Brown 2 and the status quo. States are resegregating because integration isn't federally enforced, and that's an issue. These states have no reason to integrate. My plan solves that. It withholds funding from schools that don't integrate, and past integration attempts might have been squandered, but this plan won't join the ranks of failure. Next, teacher pay is already low, and if anything, that's an incentive for schools to integrate. Integration prevents them from losing funding. And as stated by Amy Wells earlier, segregation can perpetuate racial fear, which leads to a faulty education, and integration improves the quality of education and opens the gates for challenging other forms of inequality. Black, a professor of law at the South Carolina School of Law, states that money alone cannot easily fix these challenges. And Reardon, a professor of poverty and inequality education at Stanford, stated in a study done in 2016 that where racial segregation is higher, disparities in socioeconomic conditions and the achievement gaps are on average significantly larger. So this proves the fact that segregation is harmful to everybody. Segregation ruins the chances for these kids to get a good education. And Hilbert, an associate professor of law at the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, states that funding may not improve performance at all in heavily segregated schools, and that heavily segregated schools do not provide better educational performance if they receive more money. We already have integrated schools, and the negative is basically asking you to take on faith that segregated schools can do good with more money, whereas that's not empirically proven. And equalizing funding alone will not end up solving anything. The negative doesn't challenge segregation at all. Mandatory federal integration is the only way to solve underlying issues in the education sector. But there's no reason why we can't do both. We can fund these teachers and fund these schools, and we can integrate the schools at the same time, which improves the quality of education by both integrating and paying everybody better. I agree that teachers need to be paid more, but I also think that schools need to be integrated to improve the quality of education for everybody in the United States of America. Thank you.
Okay. First, minority schools are doing worse because of a lack of funding and resources, not because they don't have enough diversity in the classroom. The affirmative has the wrong correlation and causation. See, majority white schools just have more resources than the majority minority schools that are doing worse. You see, these minority schools, if given the chance, would be able to do just as good as these other schools. My evidence is because look at the schools that are majority white and have more funding that are doing well. By definition, they are segregated just as the other schools. Their only difference is that they have funding. Minority schools just haven't been given the chance because they've been getting the short end of the stick. Next, integration doesn't increase cross-racial understanding because that's not how the world works. Plus, they're still within school segregation. See, just throwing two people in the same room doesn't automatically mean that they'll understand each other better. Sticking students together doesn't mean they'll understand each other better. Nevertheless, they're still within school segregation when schools are integrated. You see minority students sitting together while white students sit in their own groups. They inhabit separate social worlds. Now, evidence. Carter and Russell at Stanford University stated, quote, extracurricular activities and academic courses often reinforce racial lines between students. Cheerleading, baseball, and young Republicans were viewed as white sports or clubs. Primarily Latino and African American, often sat together in cafeteria at lunch or in a separate designated study room. Separation within school creates symbolic boundaries for groups, end quote. What is it saying? Even when schools are integrated, students don't like to sit together. They sit with their own groups while they're trying to form their identities. Lastly, we can't do both the plans, because by doing both the plans, you will still take role models out of schools, and there's no way that their plan is completely different from Brown versus Board of Education, and guarantees that the same things that happened years ago won't happen this time. Furthermore, if we look at the political climate right now, there's no way, the way that our government works, that we would get increased funding for schools and integrate schools. Integrating schools wasn't popular back then, and it won't be popular this time. Thank you.
All right. Doesn't class discussion solve interschool segregation?
No, because if you take into the account the amount of times you have in-class discussion, and furthermore, the amount of times you would have discussions over things like structural inequality or poverty, the amount of effect and the amount of chance for this thing to actually happen is minimal. Now, how is it that your affirmative plan makes sure that there will be no role models taken out of school?
So society has advanced since the original Brown decision, and we understand that these role models matter. So we're going to try our best to keep these role models employed in these schools. Okay. So in-class discussion doesn't actually end up like challenging like racism and structural inequality at all.
It isn't about it doesn't do anything. It's about considering the amount of instruction time where we have discussions is pretty low, and then also the fact of the matter, the topic of poverty or structural inequality doesn't come up nearly as much. The likelihood of this ever having cross-racial dialogue wouldn't happen. Now, you said that our society has changed. Now, in what ways have our societies changed that they won't just view these teachers as liabilities and just stick them where better qualified teachers are?
I mean, I think I can speak with local experience, as can many other people in this room, that like the push for teacher pay in Oklahoma proves that we don't just see teachers and faculty as liabilities, we see them as brilliant people teaching the youth of America.
Good question.
Okay. So in these segregated schools, education is oftentimes worse. How are they going to get themselves out of poverty if they aren't being taught?
Well, it isn't about them not being taught. The issue is that when you look at schools, majority white or majority minority schools that are in low-income areas, they both have the same problems. Simply putting those schools together isn't going to solve anything, because you see the underlying issue is that, for example, when there's a majority white school that has an upper middle-class area, they do better. The underlying issue is funding, not that there's not enough black or white students in the classroom. Now, how does your plan exactly provide funding for teachers?
Okay, so we are still sticking with integrating, but we are also going to like give grants to schools that integrate, and we're going to just pay teachers more. So these students that attend these segregated schools and achieve a faulty education, wouldn't that just mean they won't be able to get themselves in the workforce, and that is the cause of the financial inequality that you are speaking of?
No, because by giving them the things that they need, resources and funding, it'll make education better for those students, and by doing that, they'll be able to actually get into the workforce without being stuck in this school-to-prison pipeline and other such things that low-income communities have. Now, you say that you'll give these schools grants for these teacher pay. Now, how do you make sure that these grants actually go for the teachers and not just get taken by the school?
So we are going to like give the schools grants to incentivize them to stay integrated, and we are also going to just pay teachers more. So first, I'm going to look back at the Reardon evidence that I read. I stated that in areas where segregation is higher, the achievement gap and socioeconomic conditions and like disparities there are on average significantly larger. So this means that like these people in these segregated communities that have socioeconomic issues, they aren't able to like, they're stuck in a rut. And that is the cause of this funding inequality and this financial inequality. They aren't able to get out into the workforce, and they aren't able to, get these great jobs because most of them drop out. There's high teacher turnover rates, and they aren't being taught. So segregation ends up causing the very financial inequality that the negative keeps talking about. And the negative doesn't challenge segregation at all, whereas I integrate schools and I pay teachers more. We can have our cake and eat it too. We just gotta make up our mind. Integration can lead to cross-racial dialogue, and I can speak from experience. I have talked about social justice in my English class. I've talked about numerous issues that I wouldn't have even known anything about if I hadn't had other viewpoints in the same room with me. I would have been just as ignorant as I was forever ago without debate, without these valuable teachers to teach me. And I think everybody deserves the same chance. I think everybody deserves to be taught just as well as everybody else. And to quote Sonia Sotomayor, we won't have equality until we get equality in education. We won't have an equal society. Thank you.
First, I'd like to say that the negative is not saying that segregation is good. The negative is simply saying that the ills of education right now is not going to be solved by sticking students together. These minority schools just need to be given the chance to succeed. They have not been given the chance. The schools that have been given a chance are those middle class and upper middle class schools. These schools like Langston Hughes Academy, which is a minority school, haven't been given the funding to succeed like these other schools. See, we can't do both for the simple factor that the way that our politics works right now, there's no way we're going to get a teacher raise and also be able to get integrated schools and increase funding. We have to choose one, and choosing increased funding is the best way to solve this issue, because the underlying issue is not what people are in the classroom or what bodies are sitting in those chairs. It's the amount of funding and resource that's going to the school that's going to be teaching these children and teaching these bodies in these chairs. So, audience, I urge you to side with the negative for the factor that the most realistic way to solve this issue is to solve it with a way that we all know will work and that we know can fix these issues. Now, as Nelson Mandela said, as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. Thank you.
Let's give these two another round of applause. Gentlemen, you can take your seats in the front row. All right, if you give us just a few seconds now, I'm gonna ask that Hannibal come back up and introduce the panelists. So if you give us a few minutes so that the panelists can get up to the stage, we'll get the second part of this program started right away.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you, debaters CJ and Josh. One more round of applause for CJ and Josh. Now it's my privilege to introduce three distinguished Tulsans who will help us advance this critical dialogue. They are, in alphabetical order, Nancy McDonald, Reverend Dr. Ray Owens, and Mayor Kathy Taylor. First, Nancy McDonald. Nancy McDonald is part of a group of people proposing voluntary desegregation of Tulsa public schools and instrumental in the success of Burroughs Little School, the opening of Carver Junior High School as Tulsa's first middle school, and the integration of Booker T. Washington High School. She was also a part of the development of Emerson, Burroughs, Frost, Whitman, and Hawthorne as elementary school magnet programs. These schools were identified in the court order for desegregation in Tulsa. Because of Nancy's activism in the 1970s, when President Reagan started an initiative to get corporations involved in education in the 1980s, Nancy was one of 5 people selected to participate in the White House Symposium on Education and Corporate Engagement. Nancy went on to write the guidelines for Partners in Education groups that were published as a book, along with 2 other books, all involving community volunteers in public schools. In 1987, Nancy's youngest daughter came out to her parents as a lesbian. Nancy organized a Tulsa chapter of Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, or PFLAG. By 1994, Nancy was elected to the National PFLAG presidency and served in that office until 1998. Nancy and her husband, Dr. Joe McDonald, are recipients of numerous tributes from Tulsa's LGBTQ community, including a library in their honor at the Dennis Neal Equality Center. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Nancy McDonald. Reverend Dr. Ray A. Owens. Reverend Dr. Ray A. Owens has a passion for issues related to youth and education. He leads a multifaceted life as a husband, father, pastor, scholar, and public intellectual. He was an assistant pastor and youth minister at Union Baptist Church in Trenton, New Jersey. He worked as a public school teacher in South Central Los Angeles, California. He served as fund development director for Teach for America in New York City. In 1989, Dr. Owens earned a Bachelor of Arts in English from the University of Texas at Austin and a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary in 1998. In 2005, he earned, with honors, his Doctorate of Philosophy in Religion and Society from Princeton Theological Seminary. Since Reverend Dr. Owens became senior pastor in 2006, Metropolitan Baptist Church, known as the MET, has more than tripled in its membership base, weekly attendance, and annual budget. In addition to his pastoral duties at the Met, Reverend Dr. Owens has taught religious studies courses at Oklahoma State University Tulsa and Texas Christian University. He currently serves as the Affiliate Assistant Professor of Ethics and Black Church Studies at Phillips Theological Seminary. Reverend Dr. Owens is deeply involved in the Tulsa community. He serves on the Board of Directors for the Metropolitan YMCA and the Impact Tulsa Leadership Council. He's also an active member of both Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity and Sigma Pi Phi fraternity. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome the Reverend Dr. Ray A. Owens. Mayor Kathy Taylor. Mayor Kathy Taylor grew up in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, graduated from John Marshall High School, earned her bachelor's degree and Juris Doctorate from the University of Oklahoma. Mayor Taylor worked as an attorney for a private firm in Oklahoma City from 1981 to 1988. She then moved to Tulsa in 1989 and became vice president and general counsel of Thrifty Car Rental. Taylor bought National Car Rental from General Motors. She and her husband, William Lobeck, later sold the company and started the Lobeck-Taylor Family Foundation. In 2003, Governor Brad Henry appointed her as Secretary of Commerce, Tourism, and Workforce Development. She left that post to run for mayor, and she won on April 4, 2006. She was elected the 38th mayor of Tulsa, the city's second female mayor after Susan Savage filled that post in 1992. Mayor Taylor returned to serve as Governor Henry's Chief of Education Strategy in 2010, and in 2012 served as a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, teaching pathways to public service. From January 2017 through February 2018, she served as Tulsa's Chief of Economic Development in the office of Mayor G.T. Bynum. Through the Lobeck-Taylor Family Foundation, Mayor Taylor and her family are at the forefront of Tulsa's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Tulsa Startup Series, Cultivate 918, Kitchen 66, 36 Degrees North, and most recently, Mother Road Market are just a few of the programs supported by the Lobeck-Taylor Family Foundation. Currently, Mayor Taylor serves as chair of the Leadership Council for Impact Tulsa, a member of the Board of Directors of Breeding Partners, a USS Tulsa ship sponsor, and a member of the Board of Directors of Sonic. She's been honored by numerous civic and educational organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mayor Kathy Taylor. So let's start out with a directed question to each of you panelists alphabetically. And I'm going to ask that you keep your answers as succinct as possible so that we're able to answer as many questions as possible, because we have a lot of questions, and I sort of hinted at some of the questions earlier on. So alphabetically, we'll start with Nancy McDonald. Your question. What lessons have you gleaned from your direct experience with desegregation in Tulsa and the creation of the current Booker T. Washington High School magnet approach?
Well, I think one of the things that I learned from the experience of voluntarily integrating the elementary schools and reopening Carver and Booker T. Washington is the importance of developing trust with the people, the students that will participate in this program. It was important for us to develop relationships for the students of the various races involved to have the opportunity to get to know one another, the families, the opportunity to get to know one another. It was that experience that we had to, in many ways, facilitate the opportunity for that to happen, that really then led to our success in voluntary integration. The other thing that I think that I learned, that all parents are concerned about their children's safety. And once we could demonstrate to the parents that we as administrators, and although I was not employed by Tulsa Public Schools at that time, I was really a community volunteer, they were concerned about the safety of their students. And so we had to demonstrate that we were concerned about their safety and that we would address the issues that they expressed.
Thank you. Next question goes to Reverend Dr. Owens. In terms of integration, what is the value added from charter schools, particularly those whose chief aim is to boost the achievement levels among students of color?
So I see charter schools as one part of a larger set of solutions to the crisis in inequity in K through 12 education. It is not the only solution. But what we have learned is that for largely black and brown students from low-income families, the charter school sector creates a greater pool of choices for families who otherwise would not be able to have access to those choices. Many of us with adequate resources are able to exercise that choice for our student. We can decide to send our child to a private school, for example, that has extended learning opportunities, longer school days, which may work for our children. Oftentimes, black and brown families from low-income communities don't actually have that menu of choices. And so far the evidence seems to suggest that in many cases, our lower income families from largely black and brown communities do benefit from the choices that charters provide.
Great. Thank you. Mayor Taylor, what's the proper role of government in terms of public school integration, and how effective has government been in fulfilling that role?
Well, public education is the future of the economy. And if the racial inequity in achievement continues to exist, not in our community, but across the country, in a globally competitive world, America continues to lose its competitive edge. And so I think it has to be the highest priority of government. And I applaud Mayor Bynum. For the first time in our city's history, by ordinance, education is now a municipal priority. Because he recognized that with that could come municipal funding. How effective has government been? I don't know that it is government's primary role, but I don't think that in the past, certainly overturning Plessy versus Ferguson with Brown versus Board of Education was step one, but I think where government has missed is in helping families in poverty with transportation options and with early childhood education options and housing. Because while Brown versus Board of Education was a great first step, it has to be a broader approach, and government can make a huge impact in housing and transportation, and that will ultimately make a broader impact on both segregation, desegregation, and educational equity issues.
Okay, so let's piggyback off that and let's look at the debate proposition which centered on funding or money. Is there anything in the context of this discussion that's more important than money or funding? Anybody?
Well, we certainly need more of it. Let's just face it. One of the things that I've seen, and I still do a lot of volunteer work in the schools, one of the things that I am very much aware of is the lack of adequate resources for teachers. We're constantly struggling for the basics for children. Paper, pencils, all those things that many families living in poverty cannot provide. We struggle with outdated textbooks, and even though we have the internet and all of this, a textbook is still very important for children. Teachers need them. They need to be up to date. I think we struggle, I'm terribly concerned, Reverend Owens, with the lack of after-school activities for children. Many of our families need supervision for children from 8 until 5, their work day. And so when school is dismissed at 2:50 in the elementary, they're going home to empty houses. they're alone. Um, That time could be used for educational experiences. So I worry about the cuts that have been made in the after-school care programs for children. I want to go back and piggyback on what Mayor Taylor said, is our work in early childhood development has been absolutely phenomenal. And I think it's important to know that early child development initiative started with Hawthorne Elementary, with a group of African-American mothers who I met with in the need to desegregate that school said to me, one of the things that we would like is to have an opportunity for our children to go to a quality preschool. And so we started the prefabs at Hawthorne, the first public-funded 4-year-old program in Tulsa Public Schools at Hawthorne, which was the impetus for really moving forward in early childhood development. We also had an early childhood development center at Lowell Elementary, which was federally funded and demonstrated the value of early childhood development. And I think the research now is documenting for our children in Tulsa the incredible value of that experience.
I think at Impact Tulsa, what we found is a child who has a quality pre-K education experience is more likely to read on grade level at third grade. Kids who are more likely to read on grade level at third grade are more likely to be successfully graduated from high school. But from a resource standpoint, what we've also found is that we are one of the few states that has free all-day pre-K, yet we have open spots because parents can't take advantage of that opportunity due to a number of issues, including the transportation issue.
Transportation is a big issue. We can't, I mean, for example, we have a challenge in getting our middle school students and our high school students even to after-school activities because parents aren't available to take them. So one of the things I think that's been very successful is through the YMCA and the YES program, which is a youth soccer program in North Tulsa, which is being done by teachers who are volunteering their time to do those leagues. We now have 20 teams in 13 schools, I believe, playing. We're doing it on the school grounds because the children can stay at school. We can get them snacks through a federal funded program. And then parents can pick them up at 5 o'clock, or the majority of them in the neighborhood school walk home. So transportation is a big issue for our families. Simply cannot get children to programs outside of their neighborhood. Doesn't happen.
Dr. Owens, question for you. But
Go ahead.
So I want to just pick your brain on something that's sort of foundational to this whole discussion. What's the purpose of desegregation in your mind?
Yeah. So at the time of Brown v. Board of Education, there was a dominant feeling that it was going to take desegregation to give kids of color access to real quality education. And so I actually aligned myself with the way that Martin Luther King thought about and talked about desegregation. Desegregation is one step. So we've achieved that. We've removed the legal barriers, that prevented people of color from having access to the school of their choice in many cases. But he talked about the differentiation between desegregation and integration. And integration is not just about students being able to occupy the same physical space. Integration for King was always about sharing power, sharing resources. I mean, coming to the table with equal access to the resources of a community. That includes the education. That includes access to livable wage employment. That includes access to upward mobility opportunities. So desegregation alone is actually a pretty reductionistic approach to the larger equity issues. I think when we think about integration the way that Martin King talked about it, then we're talking about a real sense of shared power and leveling that playing field, if you will.
Let me give you a Likert scale question. Now, this will be for all of you. In Tulsa, on a spectrum, 1 to 5, 5 being the most favorable value, how integrated are we, using the definition of integrated that Dr. Owens just gave?
So if you're thinking like Martin King, the bar is really high.
Right.
And I don't know that there's a society that has achieved that. So I qualify my numeric value here with, that comment, that he's talking about an ideal in
Right.
terms of this beloved community where everybody has, equal access to the shared resources. So I would say we are between 1 and 2, and we have a long way to go to achieve real integration so that your zip code or your color code does not determine your access to the resources of the society and your capacity for personal fulfillment.
I would agree with that. I mean, I look at both the business leaders in our community and those in the pipeline, and frankly, we do not have a diverse pipeline either in terms of race or gender in our business community, and that's much of the power base in this community.
I think unfortunately, many of our graduates move away from Tulsa. And that's one of the things we really need to work on, is keeping in Tulsa. Let me talk a little bit about, and I agree, we have a long way to go, and if we could put a numerical value on it, I would say maybe a 1+. But some of the things that I've experienced in the integration, desegregation integration of our public schools is, I remember distinctly in 1971, going to Burroughs Elementary School because the school board had finally given us permission to develop a demonstration school that voluntary integration would work. And I remember going to the library at John Burroughs Elementary School and being absolutely appalled at the library because they literally had few books. And it was just amazing to me that some of the kiddos at Burroughs did not have desks, that they were sitting on the floor. This is 1971. And so it's alarming that even at that point, 1971, we were still dealing with the inadequate resource given to the schools. And so people had to rise up and say, this is not fair, this is not right, and we're going to make those changes. The same was true with Booker T in 1973. It was disgraceful, the library that was available to the students. And so with incredible leadership and both of African American and Caucasian principals, we certainly made some changes. But and I think that has changed. I think that there is equal allocation of resources to all of our schools for the most part. So I'm pleased with that. The other thing, I have this, of course, if those of you who have worked with me know I have lots of stories, okay? And I remember the federal government in 1973, we were the first school system in the nation to try to desegregate or integrate Booker T or any senior high school voluntarily. And most people at the federal level said this will never work. And so they monitored us every week. And they would come and they would walk through our halls and they would say, well, this is not working and this is not working. And your black students are sitting over there and your white students are sitting over there. And so I remember working with the principal at that point in time, H.J. Green, and Mr. Green saying to some of the kiddos, what goes here? What's going on? And a young man, and I'm going to identify him because I remember him to this day, James Bacchus, said to us, he said, well, what do you expect? these white kids are not in our neighborhood and we don't know them. And the white kids said, well, these black kids aren't in our neighborhood, we don't know them. But if you'll give us an opportunity to meet and develop relationships with one another, it won't be a problem. And I think today, even when I go out to the Booker T. Washington, and I look at the cafeteria and think of that conversation so many years ago, almost 40, more than 40 now, it seems to be a much more integrated school. But here again, they have to work at it. They have to think about opportunities to bring the students of different races, ethnicity together, religions together, to talk about who are they and what are they and why do they believe this way and what are the issues that they face. We can't forget that we have to facilitate some of those conversations as responsible, caring adults.
Let's talk a little bit about equity as opposed to simply access. So there are some people among us who would argue that class trumps race in terms of educational equity issues these days. How would you respond to that?
Class matters. So I think it was William Julius Wilson, sociologist, poverty expert, who talked about the declining influence of race, which alarmed a lot of people because it suggested that race didn't matter anymore and that it was class. And so because we have, for example, this growing black middle class, that black people and probably other people of color had kind of arrived. Well, that wasn't what Wilson was actually arguing. And if you get the nuance of his argument, you will see that he's suggesting that class is a factor in potentially advancing for people of color. But when we compare African American middle class students, for example, to their white counterparts, the disparity is still stark and real, even at a place like our, beloved Booker T. Washington, where I have a student. I mean, I think, what is it, like 9%, certainly less than 15% or so of the students of color actually access the more rigorous AP offerings there, and of our white students, it's more than the third that are taking advantage of that. So, yeah, we have access, but that doesn't produce the equity that we want. If we really, achieve that equity, then because black students and white students are about equal in number. There you see both groups having kind of equal percentages of students in those rigorous AP and IB programs. At that level, the students of color become pretty invisible. So I think that's the real challenge in terms of equity.
It's a challenge that we have been aware of and have tried to address since we put the IB program in 80, 85, 86. One of the things that I think was a real sad day for Tulsa Public is when at that point in time, the superintendent did away with the elementary magnet programs. Because what we were seeing in those 5 schools, in addition to Carver and now Thoreau, is that these youngsters at a very early age had instilled with them the initiative to achieve at a higher level. Didn't make any difference what color they were. There's somehow a philosophy in those particular schools, and I wished it existed in every school, but at that point in time it was in these schools that was really, and we were really under court mandate, particularly for Burroughs and Emerson, 50% black, 50% white. I felt that those schools, those elementary school magnet programs, did a better job of preparing our youngsters for a much more rigorous course of study at the higher level, higher education. I think it was a sad day, and I when we declared a unitary school system by the courts, I felt that we had an obligation to maintain what we had done. And unfortunately, we had a superintendent and a board of education that did not agree with that. And at that point in time, in the 90s, we're not called to task on it.
Mayor Taylor.
So at Impact Tulsa, we look deep into the statistics of 15 school districts in Tulsa County plus Sapulpa. And when we control for poverty, race matters. Black and brown kids, especially black boys, do not achieve in Tulsa County regardless of class at the level of other kids. The 8th grade math statistics which is pivotal in today's economy, is particularly disturbing. And I mean, I can't say what the cause of it is. I mean, I think implicit bias plays a part. I think we've made some progress in looking at the suspension rates that are inequitable among race. But it is something that we have to keep our eyes on. And I'm happy we have the data and that we can measure the progress. But it is, I used a word earlier. It's an urgent issue that we have to address. We have not made the progress that we should have since we broke the legal barriers.
I want to go back to one of the points that was raised by one of the debaters, was the value of the role model. I really do see that. I see that more and more. How important it is, particularly for young black boys, to have a good, positive role model, and that role model to be black. Particularly if that youngster living in poverty and the role model has also experienced poverty and has made something of himself, a good job, whatever it is, those youngsters, because we have so many single-parent families, need to have the opportunity to have a good, positive role model about what it takes to be an African-American boy, man in this society. I've seen it work. I worked this morning with, and I'm very excited about, continue to work with the YMCA and role models for some of our teenagers. Because as you know, summer's coming and they'll hang out in the basketball gyms. And if we capture them in the basketball gyms, maybe we'll have an opportunity to do some role modeling with some of the young men, successful African-American men in this community that can talk to them about what to do and how to do it and why it's important.
I know
Stay in
some of
school.
those role models will actually be teachers in our classrooms, so that the teaching force better reflects the student population of our schools. How powerful is it that the role model is not just a man, or in some cases a woman who
Right.
visits the school from time to time, or wonderful programs like Reading Partners, which does bring a lot of diverse leaders into our schools. But we have to get to the point where we remind ourselves that the most important person in any school, the biggest factor to student success is the teacher in the classroom.
Absolutely.
And all that person brings. And so one of our strategies ought to be to really work harder at recruiting men of color, and to your point, to not only be role models on the basketball court, but actually teach science and robotics and English.
Well, Reverend Owens, I have a challenge for you. This is one of my dreams, okay? We do these magnet programs. We have the engineering magnet up at Memorial, and we have the culinary at Hale. And why don't we have a teaching magnet where we would introduce young people to the profession of teaching? And maybe we would get some of our minority students into teaching. We're not doing a
think
very
that's a great
good
idea.
job of recruiting young people into this profession.
Just to follow up on that sort of line of thinking, Mayor Taylor, question for you. So we have all these beautiful, passionate, energetic folks out in the audience. Let's assume that they all want to advance the cause of true integration. What would you have them do?
Oh. Well, I mean, for me, I think one thing that's important is sharing your home and your life with a diverse group of people. So I think having a meal, having a discussion on the issues of race, I was frighteningly, I was at Mardi Gras, and that wasn't frightening, I was well behaved, but I was at Mardi Gras recently, and as I watched the kids from the region march down the street, beautiful dancers and bands, a man I had known for a long time said to me, "See, there's no problem with race here. Look, everyone's out there getting along. Why do we have to talk about it all the time?" And I think that's sometimes I call it the Tulsa Nice problem, is that we don't talk about the issue. And we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about it around a table, where, as Nancy said, we can really develop relationships and spread that kind of true integration. And we have to be very intentional about power sharing. I think to Reverend Dr. Owen's comment, I think boards and commissions in our city, institutions that we fund, when we fund an institution, when we have a vendor relationship, we need to say, what's your diversity policy? How are you promoting racial and gender diversity? I think it has to your question earlier, it has to be intentional.
Absolutely, thank you. So I've got one sort of a last question for all of you. It's kind of the lightning round. So the question is, and we'll start with Reverend Dr. Owens, what gives you hope in terms of public school integration?
So I really believe in people. I believe one of God's great creations is the human being. It is my hope that we actually leverage our capacity for good. Reinhold Niebuhr says we have the capacity to do evil, and we do. We have the capacity to do good. Oftentimes we need coercion and systems that coerce us into the good. But I believe that we are all intrinsically endowed with good, and my hope is in the goodness of people, regardless of race, class, religion, or any of those things that divide us.
Great, thank you. Mayor Taylor.
I'll just say the two young men that debated tonight.
Yeah.
That gives me hope for the future.
Absolutely, thank you. Nancy.
I think we had such a concrete example this past week at the school board meeting. And it was a long time in coming, and it's all about the name change of some of the schools. And I had the opportunity to work with Jackson Elementary in their name change. And it was so heartwarming to work with this group of people representing this school. Hispanic, African American, Caucasian, their teachers, African American, Caucasian, Native American, Hispanic. And they had this conversation around this table. They talked about what was our school all about? And what emerged from that conversation is that they said, well, we learn to respect one another. Our children learn to respect each other in this school. And this gentleman who had, I think, 7 children go through Jackson said, I think the school should be called Unity, because that's really what we're all about. We know each other, we respect each other, we live together in this neighborhood, and we value this school, and I think it should be Unity. And that gave me a lot of hope because these were the parents and the children who were saying this. And I thought, oh, if I could just integrate that into some other schools, it would be great.
Absolutely. Well, in the educational sphere, we grapple with the question of whether desegregation should be conceived as an end unto itself or merely a means to an end. Is desegregation designed to facilitate interracial social contact, true integration? Is it essential to educational equity? Are these objectives mutually exclusive? We must continue to examine what's right, what's fair, and what works. In the final analysis, we're all in this together. In the arena of public school desegregation, as in so many other aspects of our lives, understanding and appreciating our shared humanity and then living our lives in ways that honor this fundamental reality is the only route to progress and prosperity. Know, care, and act. Those three simple words are a prescription for lives well lived. Speaking of lives well lived, let's not forget Dr. Mary Jane McLeod Bethune, who lived from July 10th, 1875 to May 18th, 1955. Dr. Bethune was an American educator, stateswoman, philanthropist, humanitarian, and civil rights activist, best known for starting a private school for African American students at Daytona Beach, Florida. She attracted donations of time and money, and she ultimately transformed that school into Bethune-Cookman University. Dr. Bethune was also appointed as a national advisor to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as part of what was known as the Black Cabinet. She was known as the First Lady of the struggle because of her commitment to gain better lives for African Americans. In her last will and testament, Dr. Bethune left 9 things that I'd like to leave with you this evening. She proclaimed, "I leave you love. I leave you hope. I leave you the challenge of developing confidence in one another. I leave you a thirst for education. I leave you respect for the uses of power. I leave you faith. I leave you racial dignity. I leave you a desire to live harmoniously with your fellow man. I leave you, finally, a responsibility to our young people." Thank you, Ross Faith, for your passion for public discourse and your commitment to elevating our youth. Thank you, debaters, for your thirst for knowledge and your aim for excellence. Thank you, panelists, for your trailblazing and your difference-making. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the audience, for your interest and your enthusiasm. Thank you. Thank you all. Go in peace.